August 24th, 1944. 129 Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses roared across the German sky, their bomb bays loaded, their crews focused on a single target 500 miles east of London. The mission was clear. The factory had to be destroyed. What made this mission different, what made it one of the most controversial operations of World War II, was what surrounded that factory. A concentration camp with thousands of prisoners inside, and the Allies bombed it anyway. This is the story of Mission 132, a raid so precise it would be studied for decades, so morally complex it still haunts historians today. A story where the line between liberation and destruction blurred into something far more terrifying, where the sounds of Allied engines overhead meant both hope and horror, where prisoners prayed for the bombs to fall and feared them at the same time. This is the story of when saving lives meant risking them, when the good guys dropped bombs on the very people they were fighting to free. This is the paradox of Buchenwald. To understand what happened on that August day, you have to understand where it happened. And Buchenwald wasn't just any concentration camp. It stood on a hill called the Ettersberg, just outside Weimar, Germany, a city once celebrated as the birthplace of German constitutional democracy, the home of Goethe, the embodiment of Enlightenment values. The Nazis chose this location deliberately. Some historians believe they wanted to erase that legacy, to plant something so monstrous on that cultural soil that it would overshadow everything Weimar had once meant. The name they chose was cynically poetic: Buchenwald, beech forest. But there was nothing poetic about what happened there. Established in July 1937, Buchenwald was one of the first and largest concentration camps built within Germany's original borders. The first prisoners arrived on July 15th, 240 men forced to clear trees and build the camp that would hold them. They worked with their bare hands. They carried massive stones from the quarry. If an SS guard deemed a stone too small, the prisoner carrying it was killed on the spot. The camp expanded rapidly. Political prisoners came first: communists, socialists, anyone who opposed the Nazi regime. Then came Jehovah's Witnesses, Roma, homosexuals, criminals, prisoners of war. After Kristallnacht in November 1938, nearly 10,000 Jewish men were crammed into Buchenwald. 600 of them died within 3 months. Above the main gate, the SS installed an inscription in iron letters: Jedem das Sein, to each his own, the master race interpreting it to mean they had the right to decide who lived and who didn't, who deserved dignity and who deserved nothing. Inside those gates, hell took on a physical form. Prisoners were packed into wooden barracks originally designed to hold far fewer people than actually lived there. 2,000 souls crammed into structures meant for a fraction of that number. Sanitation was almost non-existent. Disease spread like wildfire: typhus, tuberculosis, dysentery. The camp had a 6-oven crematorium that ran constantly, and it still couldn't keep up with the bodies. The SS conducted medical experiments on prisoners. They tested viral infections. They inflicted white phosphorus burns to study wound treatments for incendiary bomb injuries. When challenged about causing death deliberately just to measure how long it took, one Nazi doctor defended himself by saying he was a legally appointed executioner. Prisoners worked 12-hour shifts in nearby factories and quarries. They were loaned out to private companies who paid the SS 4 to 6 Reichsmarks per day per prisoner. Between June 1943 and February 1945, the SS made nearly 96 million Reichsmarks from this human rental system. It was slavery, industrialized. But something else was happening at Buchenwald, something the Nazis didn't fully control. Beneath the surface of terror, a resistance movement was forming. Political prisoners, many of them communists with experience in underground organizing, had managed to secure key administrative positions within the camp. They called themselves the International Camp Committee. They kept lists. They hid people scheduled for execution. They sabotaged orders when they could. They passed messages to the outside world. and they were about to play a crucial role in what came next. Because in 1942, as the war intensified and Germany's need for weapons grew desperate, the SS built something adjacent to Buchenwald that would change everything. An armaments factory. The Gustloff-Werk II wasn't just any factory, it was a massive industrial complex that manufactured components essential to the German war machine: rifles, carbines, pistols, gun mounts, optical devices, and most critically, parts for the V-1 and V-2 rockets, Hitler's vengeance weapons that were raining down on London and other Allied cities, killing thousands of civilians. Between 5,000 and 6,000 Buchenwald prisoners worked in that factory, forced to build the very weapons being used against the people trying to liberate them. 13 factory buildings surrounded by electrified barbed wire, watched over by 13 guard towers. The location was strategic. The factory used the camp's slave labor. The prisoners had no choice but to produce. Refuse to work, and you died. Work too slowly, and you died. The factory was productive, efficient, deadly. By mid-1944, the Allies knew about it. They had aerial reconnaissance photos. They'd been flying missions over the area since April. They photographed the synthetic oil plant at Monowitz near Auschwitz. They photographed railway lines. They photographed industrial targets all over occupied Europe. And in those photographs, clearly visible, was Buchenwald. They knew what it was. Allied intelligence had received reports about Nazi concentration camps as early as 1942. They knew about the mass extermination of Jews. They knew about the brutal conditions. But the strategic calculus of war is cold, and the decision-makers in Washington and London were focused on one objective: defeat the Nazi war machine by any means necessary. That meant bombing factories, even factories next to concentration camps. But here's where the story gets more complicated, because prisoners inside Buchenwald had been trying to get the Allies to bomb them. Through the underground resistance network, messages had been smuggled out. Secret communications passed through channels that shouldn't have existed. The prisoners knew about the factory. They worked in it every day. They understood its importance to the Nazi war effort. And many of them had come to a terrible conclusion: bombing the factory was worth the risk. This wasn't universal. Some prisoners were terrified of the idea. Some believed the bombs would kill them all. But others, especially those in the resistance, felt differently. They'd rather die from Allied bombs than continue enabling Nazi victory. They'd rather risk immediate death than prolonged suffering with no hope of liberation. A Polish engineer named Gwizdon Damazin, imprisoned since March 1941, had secretly built a shortwave radio transmitter. It was hidden in the prisoner's movie room, powered by a small generator. In the coming months, he would use it to send an SOS directly to General Patton's army. But for now, in the summer of 1944, messages were getting out through other means. "Bomb us," the messages said. "Destroy the factory. Don't worry about us." The question was whether the Allies would listen. Lieutenant Colonel Allison C. Brooks would later describe the briefing for Mission 132. The intelligence officer, he recalled, stressed one critical point. There was presumed to be a concentration camp next to the factory. Presumed, not confirmed, not studied, not carefully considered. The mission was approved. The crews were told their target was a weapons facility producing V-2 rocket components. They were told it needed to be destroyed. Whether they were told about the thousands of prisoners who would be directly in the blast zone is unclear. What's certain is that on August 24, 1944, 129 B-17s took off from RAF Dienethorpe, 100 miles north of London. They were heading straight for Buchenwald. Imagine being a prisoner at Buchenwald that morning. You wake in a crowded barrack that smells of disease and death. You eat your meager ration, if you can call it eating. You line up for roll call, standing for hours, while SS guards count you like cattle. Then you march to the factory, 12-hour shift. Building weapons for the enemy, knowing that every rifle you assemble, every component you manufacture, might kill an Allied soldier. And then, shortly after noon, you hear it. A sound you've never heard before, a sound that makes your heart stop and race at the same time. The drone of engines, hundreds of them, growing louder. Some prisoners had worked in factories before. Some had lived through air raids in their home countries before being captured. They recognized the sound immediately. Allied bombers, American bombers. And they were close. The 129 B-17 Flying Fortresses approached in formation. Inside each aircraft, young men, boys really, most of them barely 20 years old, checked their instruments, adjusted their positions, prepared for the bomb run. They'd done this before. France, Belgium, other parts of Germany. But this was different. The intelligence officers' words echoed in some of their minds. Concentration camp next door. Others focused purely on the target, the factory, the mission, the job. The bombardiers adjusted their sights. At this point in the war, the technology for true precision bombing didn't exist. You could aim for a specific building, but you couldn't guarantee where every bomb would land. Wind, altitude, mechanical variations, all of it introduced uncertainty. Even the most precise bombing raid of 1944 was, by modern standards, devastatingly imprecise. But Mission 132 would be remembered as one of the most accurate bombing operations of the entire war. Inside Buchenwald, the prisoners' reactions split into two camps. Some ran for cover, though the SS had provided no air raid shelters for prisoners, hadn't even allowed them to take shelter during alarms. Running meant being shot. Staying meant being bombed. Others stood in the open, watching the sky, tears streaming down their faces. Because for the first time since their imprisonment, the Allies were here, above them, visible, real. One survivor would later write, "We were no longer afraid of death. At any rate, not of that death. Every bomb that exploded filled us with joy and gave us new confidence in life." Think about that. The bombs falling on them gave them joy. Because they weren't Nazi bombs. They were Allied bombs. They meant the world hadn't forgotten. They meant the war was being fought. They meant someone, somewhere, was trying to stop this, even if that meant some of them would die. The bombs fell at 12:47 p.m. High explosive ordnance, incendiary bombs, hundreds of them, screaming down from aircraft flying at altitude. The bombardiers had aimed for the factory complex, 13 buildings packed with machinery, materials, and prisoners forced to work. The accuracy was remarkable. The main force of the bombing hit exactly where it was supposed to. The factory buildings erupted in flames and explosions. Secondary detonations as stored ammunition ignited. The blast was catastrophic, total. The Gustloff-Werk II was essentially erased from existence. But some bombs, diverted by wind, fell short. Incendiaries landed in the prisoner camp itself. The tailor shop caught fire. The shoemaker shop, the laundry, the disinfection station. Flames spread rapidly through wooden structures designed to burn. Smoke filled the air, thick and black, mixing with dust from pulverized buildings. And then there was the collateral damage no one could have predicted. In a special section of Buchenwald, isolated from the main population, the Nazis kept VIP prisoners, people too important to simply execute, but too dangerous to let go. German generals suspected of involvement in the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler. Norwegian students, members of aristocratic families. One of these prisoners was Princess Mafalda of Hesse, daughter of the King of Italy. She'd been arrested after Italy switched sides and imprisoned at Buchenwald under a false name. She was kept in a small house in this VIP section. A bomb hit her building directly. The structure collapsed. Princess Mafalda was buried up to her neck in debris. One of her arms was torn, terribly burned. Other prisoners eventually pulled her out and carried her to the camp brothel, the only place with women who might care for her. The camp doctors operated, but her arm became infected. They amputated it. She died 4 days later. The bombing of Buchenwald killed 388 prisoners and wounded approximately 2,000 more. SS personnel were also killed, 5 of them in the military hospital that was hit. The raid destroyed not just the factory, but also critical SS administrative buildings, including the political section where prisoner records were kept. For weeks afterward, no new prisoners could be processed into Buchenwald because the paperwork system had been obliterated. In the chaos during and immediately after the attack, something extraordinary happened. The camp's underground resistance movement, the same people who had been secretly communicating with the Allies, used the confusion to raid the SS armory. They stole weapons, rifles, pistols, ammunition. They hid them throughout the camp, in places the guards would never look. Those weapons would be critical 8 months later during the liberation. The Americans never returned to bomb Buchenwald again. The factory was gone. The mission was accomplished. But the questions it raised would echo for decades. Let's step back. Let's look at what happened with clear eyes and ask the questions that still don't have easy answers. Should the Allies have bombed Buchenwald? On one hand, the strategic case was clear. The Gustloff-Werk II was producing weapons that killed Allied soldiers and civilians. V-2 rockets were terror weapons specifically designed to demoralize civilian populations. Every day that factory operated, more people died. From a purely military standpoint, the target was legitimate and necessary. And the execution was remarkably precise. By the standards of 1944 bombing technology, Mission 132 was a textbook operation. The vast majority of bombs hit exactly what they were aimed at. The prisoner barracks, visible in aerial photos at the upper right of the complex, were virtually untouched by high-explosive bombs. Most prisoner casualties came from incendiaries blown off course and from working in the factory itself when it was hit. The raid accomplished its objective. Production at the Gustloff facility never resumed. Prisoners who had been forced to make weapons were no longer forced to make weapons. But 388 people died. People who were already victims. People who had committed no crime. People who were imprisoned specifically because of who they were. Their religion, their politics, their nationality, their sexual orientation. And here's the thing that makes it even more complex. Many of those prisoners supported the bombing. Survivor testimonies reveal a split reaction. Some were terrified, traumatized, angry that the Allies would risk their lives. But many others expressed something different: relief, pride, a sense that they were finally part of the fight against Nazism rather than passive victims of it. One survivor recalled, "We thought, finally, they're doing something. We knew people would die. We were dying anyway. At least this death meant something." Compare this to the debate about Auschwitz. Throughout the summer of 1944, Jewish leaders and the War Refugee Board pleaded with American and British officials to bomb the gas chambers and crematoria at Auschwitz-Birkenau, where hundreds of thousands of Hungarian Jews were being murdered. The debate raged for months. The requests were denied. The official reasons given were practical. Aircraft didn't have sufficient range or accuracy. It would divert resources from the main war effort, and bombing would kill prisoners. But many historians argue the real reason was indifference, a lack of political will to take specific action to save Jews. Buchenwald was different. The Allies weren't bombing Buchenwald to save prisoners. They were bombing a factory that happened to be next to a camp. The prisoners were incidental to the strategic objective. Is that better or worse? Assistant General John J. McCloy, who rejected requests to bomb Auschwitz, argued that such operations would be of such doubtful efficacy that it would not warrant the use of our resources. Yet, within days of that statement, the U.S. Army Air Force heavily bombed the I.G. Farben industrial complex at Auschwitz, the same complex that employed concentration camp prisoners. The moral mathematics of war creates impossible equations. How many prisoner deaths equal the value of destroying a weapons factory? How do you weigh immediate civilian casualties against potential future military casualties? When does collateral damage become acceptable? When does it become monstrous? The bombing of Buchenwald sits in a gray zone that makes us deeply uncomfortable. Because both things are true simultaneously. It was a militarily justified operation that killed innocent people who were already being victimized. And here's what haunts me most about this story. The prisoners who worked in that factory, who were killed by the bombs meant to free them, were building weapons under threat of death. They had no choice. The Nazis would have executed them for sabotage or refusing to work. So they built rifles and rockets, knowing those weapons would kill Allied soldiers. And then Allied bombs killed them. Think about the pilots. Young Americans flying those B-17. Many of them probably didn't know exactly what Buchenwald was. They knew it was a concentration camp, but did they understand what that meant in 1944? Did they know about the gas chambers, the systematic extermination, the scale of the Holocaust? Some survivors would later meet their liberators, American soldiers who entered Buchenwald in April 1945. Those soldiers were shocked, traumatized by what they found. Many said they'd had no idea, no concept that human beings could do this to other human beings. If the ground troops didn't fully understand, how much did the bomber crews know 8 months earlier? And does it matter? Does ignorance excuse the 388 deaths? Or does knowledge make it worse? There's no comfortable answer. There's no moral high ground here, just shades of gray in a war defined by absolutes. The bombing of Buchenwald marked a turning point, not just because the factory was destroyed, but because of what it represented to the prisoners. The Allies were close. The war was being fought on German soil now. Liberation, if they could just survive long enough, might actually come. The weapons stolen during the raid were carefully hidden and maintained. The International Camp Committee quietly organized. They prepared for the moment when the SS would either evacuate or execute everyone. Because that moment was coming. By February 1945, Buchenwald held over 112,000 prisoners, the largest still-functioning concentration camp in the Nazi system. Auschwitz had been liberated by Soviet forces in January. The western camps were being evacuated ahead of Allied advances. Thousands of prisoners from Auschwitz and Gross-Rosen arrived at Buchenwald after brutal death marches. Many died within days of arrival. The little camp, a quarantine section with prefabricated horse stables converted to barracks, became a death zone. As many as 2,000 prisoners crammed into buildings meant for a fraction of that. Between January and April 1945, 6,000 people died in the little camp alone. In early April, as American forces approached from the west, the SS received orders to evacuate Buchenwald. They began forcing prisoners on death marches. 28,000 people were evacuated between April 6th and 11th. About a third of them didn't survive the journey. Many were shot by guards. Others died of exhaustion, starvation, or exposure. But the resistance delayed and obstructed the evacuation where they could. They lost lists. They hid prisoners. They used the administrative positions they'd quietly secured over years to save as many lives as possible. On April 8th, Guidon Damazin and Russian prisoner Konstantin Ivanovich Leonov sent their message using the secret radio. To the Allies, to the army of General Patton, this is the Buchenwald concentration camp. SOS. We request help. They want to evacuate us. The SS wants to destroy us. They repeated it in English, German, and Russian. On April 11, 1945, at 10 a.m., the remaining SS guards received orders to abandon the camp. The resistance had been preparing for this moment. They retrieved the weapons stolen 8 months earlier during the bombing raid. They stormed the watchtowers. Starved, emaciated men who should barely have been able to walk seized control of Buchenwald. Hours later, at 3:15 p.m., advance elements of the U.S. 6th Armored Division entered the camp. They found 21,000 prisoners still alive, walking skeletons, living corpses, piles of bodies that hadn't been cremated, the evidence of industrial-scale murder and brutality. General Dwight D. Eisenhower ordered nearby German civilians to tour the camp, to see what had been done in their name. Many claimed they didn't know. How could they not have known? The camp was miles from Weimar. The crematorium smoke was visible for miles. The prisoners worked in local factories. But that's a different moral question for a different story. The prisoners who survived, including those who had survived the August 24th bombing, were finally free. But freedom came with survivors' guilt, trauma that would last lifetimes, and memories that could never be erased. Among the survivors was a 15-year-old Hungarian Jewish boy who had arrived at Buchenwald after surviving Auschwitz. His name was Eliezer Wiesel. He would later win the Nobel Peace Prize and become one of the most important voices ensuring the Holocaust would never be forgotten. In his memoir, Wiesel wrote about the August bombing of the IG Farben plant near Auschwitz, where he'd been imprisoned before Buchenwald. We were no longer afraid of death, at any rate, not of that death. The prisoners had experienced something most of us will never understand, a form of suffering so complete that bombs falling from the sky felt like relief. So, what do we do with this story? The bombing of Buchenwald sits at the intersection of military necessity and human tragedy. It was both a successful operation and a catastrophe. It saved lives by destroying a weapons factory and cost lives by killing prisoners. It was justified and inexcusable. It was precise and devastating. The truth is, there was no good choice in August 1944. Let the factory operate, and more Allied soldiers and civilians die from the weapons it produced. Bomb it, and prisoners die. The decision-makers chose the military objective over the humanitarian concern. Can we judge them for that? From our position 80 years later, comfortable and safe, with full knowledge of how the story ends? Maybe, maybe not. But here's what we can do. We can remember. We can sit with the discomfort of moral ambiguity. We can acknowledge that war creates impossible situations where every choice leads to death, and the only question is whose death and how many. The 388 prisoners who died on August 24, 1944, died because the Allies bombed a factory built by the Nazis using slave labor. They died as casualties of a liberation they'd been praying for. They died from bombs dropped by the good guys. Their deaths weren't meaningless. The factory was destroyed, production stopped, the weapons it would have built never killed anyone. But their deaths weren't heroic either. They didn't volunteer. They didn't have a choice. They were imprisoned for being Jewish or political enemies, or simply being in the wrong place when the Nazis came. And then they died because they were in the wrong place when the Allies came. This is what war does. It strips away easy answers. It creates paradoxes where liberation looks like destruction, and salvation sounds like screaming engines overhead. The prisoners of Buchenwald knew this in a way most of us never will. They lived in a world where Allied bombs were both their greatest hope and their immediate threat, where the sound of B-17 engines meant both rescue and death. And when those bombs fell, many of them stood in the open, watching the sky, crying and cheering at the same time. Because freedom, they understood, doesn't come clean. Liberation isn't neat. Survival often means being willing to risk death. And sometimes being saved means being hurt by your saviors. On April 11, 1945, when the 6th Armored Division rolled into Buchenwald, they saw an American flag hanging from one of the camp buildings. The prisoners had made it from scraps, strips of cloth, pieces of uniform, whatever they could find. Red, white, and blue, hanging in the wind. Those prisoners had been bombed by Americans 8 months earlier, and they still raised the American flag, because they understood something profound. The bombs that killed 388 of their fellow prisoners came from the same nation that was fighting to free them. The tragedy and the hope were inseparable. This is the paradox of Buchenwald. This is what happens when the Allies bomb a concentration camp. This is what war looks like when you strip away the mythology and face the complicated, painful truth. There are no heroes in this story, just people making impossible choices in impossible circumstances. Some choices saved lives. Some ended them. Many did both. And 80 years later, we're still trying to figure out what it all means.